from Peter Sloterdijk's book, In the World Interior of Capital. Chapter 33, The Crystal Palace. Among those 19th century authors who observed the advanced games of aggressive world disclosure with critical reserve from the retarded Eastern European periphery, it is Fyodor Dostoevsky who proved the most prescient. In his tale Notes from Underground, published in 1864, which was not only the founding certificate of modern ressentiment psychology, but also the first expression of an anti-globalization stance, assuming such backdating is legitimate, there is a formulation that encapsulates the world becoming of the world at the incipient end of the globalization age with unsurpassed metaphorical power. I am thinking of the reference to Western civilization as a crystal palace. On his visit to London in 1862, Dostoevsky had visited the site built for the International Exhibition in South Kensington, which was meant to surpass the Crystal Palace of 1851 in size, and instinctively grasped the immeasurable symbolic and programmatic dimensions of the hubristic construction. As the exhibition building bore no name of its own, it seems likely that Dostoevsky transferred the name Crystal Palace to it. The gigantic original, designed by the garden-building expert Joseph Paxton, had been erected in London's Hyde Park in the autumn of 1850 as a prefabricated construction, and opened on 1st of May 1851 in the presence of the young Queen Victoria, before being rebuilt on an even larger scale in the suburb of Sydenham Hill in 1854. Until its destruction in an enormous blaze in 1936, it was considered a technological world wonder, a triumph of serial production with military precision. From that point on, a new aesthetics of immersion began its triumphal march through modernity. The psychedelic capitalism of today was already a fait accompli in the almost immaterialized, artificially climatized building. In the course of the First World Exhibition, it hosted some 17,000 exhibitors, of whom 7,200 came from Great Britain and its 32 colonies alone. With its construction, the principle of the interior overstepped a critical boundary. From then on, it meant neither the middle or upper-class home, nor its projection onto the sphere of urban shopping arcades. Rather, it began to endow the outside world as a whole with a magical immanence transfigured by luxury and cosmopolitanism. Once it had been converted into a large hothouse and an imperial culture museum, it revealed the timely tendency to make both nature and culture indoor affairs. And although the Crystal Palace was not originally intended for musical performances, it became the site of remarkable concerts, anticipating the era of stadium pop with classical programs presented to huge audiences. Not long afterwards, Dostoevsky associated the sceptical impressions from his London visit with the intense aversions he felt when reading Chernyshevsky's 1863 novel What Is to Be Done, developing the most powerful vision of civilization critique in the 19th century from the combination of ideas. In his resolutely pro-Western book, which enjoyed considerable fame at the time, he had announced, with consequences that extended all the way to Lenin, the birth of the new human being who, having found the technological solution to the social question, would live with its kind in a communal palace of glass and metal. The archetype of living communities in the East and the West. Chernyshevsky's cultural palace had been designed as a climatized luxury shell in which there would be an eternal spring of consensus. Here the sun of good intentions would shine day and night, and the peaceful coexistence of all with all could be taken for granted. Boundless sentimentality would characterize the internal climate, and an overstretched humanitarian domestic morality would result in a spontaneous empathy of all with the fates of all. For Dostoevsky, the image of the whole of society moving into the palace of civilization symbolized the will of the Western branch of humanity to conclude the initiative it had started, to make the world happy and achieve mutual understanding between peoples in a prehistorically relaxed state. After the writer had become acquainted with existence in a house of the dead through his deportation to Siberia, the prospect of a closed house of life now revealed itself to him. Biopolitics begins as enclosure building. This is where the motif of the end of history began its triumph. The visionaries of the 19th century, like the communists of the 20th, already understood that after the expiry of combatant history, social life could only take place in an expanded interior, a domestically organised and artificially climatised inner space. Whatever one considers real history to be, it should, like its spearheads, namely seafaring and wars of expansion, remain an epitome of open-air enterprises. If historical struggles are to lead to eternal peace, however, social life in its entirety would have to be integrated into a protective shell. No more historic events could take place under such conditions, at most domestic accidents. Accordingly, there would no longer be politics or voters, only mood competitions between parties and the fluctuations among their consumers. Who can deny that in its primary aspects the Western world, especially the European Union after its relative completion in May 2004 and the signing of its constitution in October of the same year, embodies precisely such a great interior today? This gigantic hothouse of relaxation is devoted to a merry and hectic cult of Baal, for whom the 20th century suggested the term consumerism. The capitalist Baal that Dostoevsky saw in the shocking sight of the World Exhibition Palace in the amusement-seeking London masses takes shape as much in the enclosure itself as in the hedonistic tumult within it. Here a new doctrine of last things is formulated as a dogmatics of consumption. The construction of the Crystal Palace can only be followed by the crystallization of circumstances as a whole. With this fateful term, Arnold Galen follows on directly from Dostoevsky. Crystallization means the intention to generalize boredom normatively and prevent the re-eruption of history into the post-historical world. Furthering the protecting benevolent ossification would be the goal of all future state power. Naturally, the boredom guaranteed by the Constitution will cloak itself in the project form. Its psychosocial signature tune is the atmosphere of departure, its basic key optimism. Everything in the post-historical world must actually be geared towards the future, as it offers the only promise that can be made unconditionally to an association of consumers. That comfort and convenience will never stop flowing and growing. Thus the concept of human rights is inseparable from the great departure to comfort, in that the freedoms those rights entail prepare the self-fulfillment of the consumer. They are, consistently enough, only on everyone's lips where there is an intention to set up the institutional, legal and psychodynamic substructure of consumerism. Dostoevsky was quite convinced, however, that eternal peace in the Crystal Palace would mentally compromise its inhabitants. In humans, the Christian psychologist tells us, relaxation inevitably leads to the release of evil. In the climate of universal comfort, what was once original sin comes to light as trivial freedoms to do evil. In addition, once evil is deprived of its historical pretexts and utilitarian facades, it can only crystallize into its quintessential form in the state of post-historical boredom, skukka. Purged of all excuses, it now becomes apparent, perhaps surprisingly for the naive, that evil possesses the quality of a mere mood. It manifests itself as a fathomless positing, a willful taste for making oneself and others suffer, a roaming destruction with no specific reason. Modern evil is unemployed negativity, an unmistakable product of the post-historical situation. Its popular edition is the sadomasochism of the middle-class household, where harmless people tie each other to the bedpost for the sake of new experiences, and its luxury version is aesthetic snobbery, which asserts the primacy of coincidental preference. On the youth markets, where the prêt-à-revolter is distributed, integrated evil appears as cool. Worthy or unworthy, both depend on a roll of the dice. In boredom, one thing is valued and the other discarded for no particular reason. Whether one joins Kant and calls this evil radical is, in real terms, of no consequence. As its root cannot extend any deeper than the mood, there is nothing to be gained by calling it radical. This raises an ontological thunderstorm to declare that no one knows where evil ultimately comes from. Do we still need to point out that Heidegger's great phenomenology of boredom from 1929 to 30 can only be understood as an escape from the Crystal Palace established throughout Europe, albeit heavily damaged by the effects of war, whose inner moral and cognitive climate, the inevitable absence of any valid conviction and the superfluity of all personal decisions, is grasped more clearly in those deliberations than anywhere else. With his description of inauthentic existence in the notorious sections on the they, probably inspired by Kierkegaard's invectives against the audience in A Literary Review, in Being and Time, 1927, Heidegger prepared his investigation into the basic disposition of bored design. This is where the phenomenological revolt against the hardships of residing in the technological shell took form. What he later calls in framing, Gestell, is presented in detail for the first time here, especially in terms of inauthentic, self-deprived existence. Where everyone is the other and no one themselves, humans are cheated of their ecstasy, their loneliness, their own decisions, their own direct connection to the absolute outside, namely death. Mass culture, humanism and biologism are the cheerful masks that, according to the insights of philosophers, conceal the profound boredom of an existence devoid of challenge. The task of philosophy would then be to shatter the glass roof over one's own head and directly make the individual the monstrous once again. Anyone who remembers the phenomenon of punk, which haunted youth cultures in the 1970s and 1980s, has a second example to illustrate the connection between the omnipresent fluidum of boredom and generalized aggression. In a sense, Heidegger was the punk philosopher of the 1920s, an angry young intellectual who shook at the imprisoning bars of institutional philosophy. Not only those, however, but also the bars of urban comfort and the welfare state's systems of existential expropriation. To appreciate his philosophical motifs, that is to say, the core of temporal logic in his reflections, one must recognise them as an attempt willfully to re-dramatise the post-historical world of boredom, even at the price of making catastrophe the teacher of life. In this sense, Heidegger could have said of the national revolution to which he temporarily showed allegiance that an age of rehistorisation had begun in that time and place, and that he was not only there, but had also thought it in advance and heroically deduced its meaning. As the dramaturge of a being that was meant to take place anew, Heidegger articulated the aim of escaping post-historical shallowness from the position of the centre of reflection that was Germany, allowing history to return as if at the last moment. By this logic, one should note, history is medially suffered rather than made. As the only people capable of suffering from the open and monstrous, the Germans should have their turn on a grand scale once more, and call upon the world to witness their passion. According to the philosopher, they would have been entitled to prove that amid the comfortable and the arbitrary there is still an evidence that can command historical actions, an evidence that presents itself more readily to the obedient ear than the sceptical eye. For no one can see outside, but there are some who can hear the call from without. Had the Germans achieved what Heidegger's fabulation expected of them, they would have made it clear to friends and foes alike that they were the ones for whom the light of necessity was shining, as if for the last time. The historico-philosophical might of Dostoevsky's Crystal Palace metaphor can best be judged by placing it next to Walter Benjamin's interpretation of the Parisian arcades. The comparison is a natural one, for in both cases an architectural form was declared the key to understanding the capitalist condition of the world. Viewed synchronously, it immediately becomes clear why Benjamin falls behind Dostoevsky, even though the latter contented himself with a rather laconic poetic vision, while the former immersed himself in studying his subject for many years. Benjamin's investigations of being in the world as dazzlement by the capitalist Maya were doomed to implausibility through their choice of object, especially as they took the risk from the outset of explaining using an anachronistic phenomenon to explain a current one. They remained fixated on the architecturally, economically, urbanistically and aesthetically obsolete type of building, which was then meant to carry the full burden of a hermeneutics of capital. The well-known statement that he had wanted to write a prehistory of the 19th century using the arcades reveals Benjamin's unclear pretensions in searching for the timeless within the outdated. Benjamin wanted to see the ciphers of alienation in all expressions of the modern monetary context, as if not only the good Lord was in the details, as Spinozists and Warburgians believe, but also the adversary. The ideology of the detail fed off the supposition that exchange value, the genius malignus of the modern world, which supposedly is otherwise invisible, takes form in the ornaments of commodity and reveals itself in the arabesque of arcade architecture. Following such a superstition of details, Benjamin's investigations become stuck in subterranean library studies, forced into a dead end of a constrained ingenuity. The more material they accumulated, the more they buried the enterprise's fruitful idea of exposing the interior and context-creating power of the capitalist modus vivendi. Benjamin's interpretation of the arcades was inspired by the realistic, albeit trivial, Marxist observation that the shiny surfaces of the commodity world conceal a less pleasant, sometimes bleak working world. This insight was distorted by the suggestion that the capitalist world context, as such, was hell, populated by damned souls who regrettably learned no political lessons from their damnation. With dark illusions, he implied that the pretty world under glass was a metamorphosis of Dante's Inferno. Against this background, it was impossible to gain an idea of how the arcades could be converted democratically, and, more importantly still, to clarify whether it would be conceivable, or at least desirable for the masses to break out of the matrix or field of capitalism. Viewed as a whole, Benjamin's studies document the vengeful joy of the melancholic who compiles an archive of evidence to show that the world has gone wrong. If one were to attempt a continuation of Benjamin's important suggestions for the later 20th and early 21st centuries, they would require not only a number of indispensable methodological rectifications, but also a fundamental reorientation. They would have to be adapted to the architectural models of today, above all the shopping malls which, from the opening of Southdale near Minneapolis, the first complex of its kind in October 1954, spread through the USA and the rest of the world like an epidemic. Exhibition centres, major hotels, sports arenas and indoor amusement parks. Such studies could then bear titles closer to the Crystal Palaces Project or the Hot Houses Project, or ultimately even the space stations project. The arcades undeniably embodied a suggestive spatial idea in the age of incipient consumerism. They carried out in a public interior that merging of the salon and the universe which Benjamin found so stimulating. In the researcher's eyes, they were the temples of commodity capital, streets of lascivious commerce only, a projection of the Oriental bazaar into the bourgeois world, symbolising the metamorphosis of all things by the light of buyability, the scene of a fairy that enchants customers into rulers of the world for the duration of their visit. The Crystal Palace, however, the one in London that housed the Great Exhibition and later a leisure park devoted to education of the people, and even more so the one in Dostoevsky's text, which was intended to make society as a whole an exhibit in itself, already pointed far beyond the architecture of the arcades. Benjamin made frequent reference to the building, but saw little more in it than a magnified arcade, just as he saw only cities of arcades in Fourier's plans for utopian communities. Here his admirable physiognomic vision let him down. He disregarded the basic rule of media analysis, namely that the format is the message. For while the elitist arcades, which never reached a large scale, served the cosification and urbane mise-en-scene of the world of commodities in a sheltered promenade, the gigantic Crystal Palace, the valid prophetic building form of the 19th century, which was immediately copied all over the world, already anticipated an integral, experience-oriented popular capitalism, in which no less than the comprehensive absorption of the outside world in a fully calculated interior was at stake. The arcades formed a canopied intermezzo between streets or squares. The Crystal Palace, on the other hand, invoked the idea of an enclosure so spacious that one might never have to leave it, a possibility Dostoevsky went through with the thought experiment of a fenced-in palace in The House of the Dead. Its growing integrativity, admittedly, did not serve the elevation of capitalism to a religion that universalized guilt and debt, as Benjamin surmised in an eccentric early fragment. On the contrary, it led to the replacement of the psychosemantic shield offered by the historical religions, which with activistic symptoms of provisions for existence. This larger and more abstract interior cannot be brought to light with Benjamin's methods of digging for treasure in libraries. Having accepted the Crystal Palace metaphor as an emblem of the final ambitions of modernity, one can restate the oft-noted and oft-denied symmetry between the capitalist and socialist programs. The socialist-communist project was simply the second building site of the Palace project. After its closure, it seemed likely that communism was a stage on the way to consumerism. The streams of desire can unfold far more powerfully in the capitalist interpretation of consumerism. Gradually, even those who had bought bonds in socialism on the stock exchange of illusions, bonds of which a few will be preserved, like yellowed 1 million Reichsmark notes from 1923, had to admit this. As for capitalism, we can only now say that it always meant more than the relations of production. Its shaping power had always gone much further than can be encapsulated in the thought figure of the global market. It implies the project of placing the entire working life, wish life, and expressive life of the people it affected within the immanence of spending power.